Chapter 1. Miss Marple and the Tragedy of the Abandoned Cottage. A soft mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead as the evening drew in, casting an eerie glow over the quiet village. The air smelled of damp earth and distant wood smoke, a telltale sign that autumn had settled in comfortably. The streets, usually abuzz with the chatter of villagers running errands, had fallen into their usual nighttime hush, disturbed only by the occasional creak of a shop sign swaying in the breeze. Miss Jane Marple, comfortably seated by her sitting-room fire, had just finished a rather absorbing article on the decline of traditional lace-making, when a knock at the door interrupted her peace. She glanced at the clock. 8:30. An unusual time for visitors. When she opened the door, she found a rather breathless young woman standing before her. Lucy Weatherby, the vicar's niece, was pale, her hazel eyes wide with alarm. "Oh, Miss Marple, I do hope I'm not disturbing you," Lucy stammered, glancing over her shoulder as if she feared someone had followed her. "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied kindly, stepping aside to allow the girl in. "Come and warm yourself by the fire." Lucy hesitated before stepping inside, fidgeting with the buttons of her cardigan. "Miss Marple, I don't quite know who else to turn to. Something awful has happened." Miss Marple's expression remained mild, but she did not miss the way Lucy twisted her fingers together, a nervous habit. "Take a deep breath, dear, and tell me what's troubling you." Lucy sat on the edge of the floral-patterned armchair, eyes darting around the cosy sitting room as if trying to gather her thoughts. "It's the abandoned cottage on the edge of the village. You know the one, don't you? Just past the old mill?" Miss Marple nodded. The cottage had stood empty for years, its ivy-covered walls giving it the forlorn air of a forgotten place. "Well," Lucy continued, lowering her voice, "I saw a light there this evening." Miss Marple tilted, her head slightly. "A light? Yes, and what's more?" Lucy swallowed hard. "I heard something. A terrible, awful sound." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her knitting forgotten on her lap. "What sort of sound, my dear?" A scream. A hush fell over the room, broken only by the quiet ticking of the mantel clock. "A scream," Miss Marple repeated gently. Lucy nodded, her hands now clasped tightly together. "I was walking home from Mrs. Bantry's house when I noticed it. The cottage is supposed to be empty, isn't it? But there was a faint glow from one of the windows. I stopped to look, and then I heard it. A woman's scream, clear as day." Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened slightly, though her expression remained placid. "And you saw no one?" "No one," Lucy confirmed. "But I was so frightened. I ran all the way here. Miss Marple, what if something terrible has happened?" Miss Marple sat back, fingers lightly tapping the armrest. "Well, my dear, one mustn't assume the worst without proof. However, a light in an abandoned cottage and a scream in the night. Yes, that is certainly worth investigating." Lucy exhaled a sigh of relief. "Then you believe me?" "Of course, dear," Miss Marple said warmly. "It wouldn't do to dismiss a young lady's intuition. Now, let us consider. The cottage has been empty for years. If someone was inside, they must have had a reason for being there. The question is, was it an innocent reason or not?" Lucy shuddered. "It didn't sound innocent." Miss Marple reached for her shawl. "Perhaps we should take a little stroll tomorrow morning and see what we can find." Lucy nodded eagerly, though the flicker of apprehension in her eyes remained. As the young woman left, Miss Marple sat for a while, gazing thoughtfully into the flames of the fire. An abandoned cottage, a mysterious light, and a scream. In the dark. It had all the makings of something rather sinister, and Miss Marple had never been one to ignore a puzzle. Chapter 2. Miss Marple and the Tragedy of the Abandoned Cottage. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves as Miss Marple stepped onto the winding path that led to the edge of the village. She had arranged to meet Lucy Weatherby at the churchyard gate, and true to her word, the young woman was already there, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "You came," Lucy said with visible relief as Miss Marple approached. "Of course, dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "A promise is a promise." She adjusted her hat, fastening the ribbon securely beneath her chin. "Shall we?" Lucy nodded, though there was hesitation in her posture as they set off down the narrow lane. The path was still damp from the morning dew, and a thin veil of mist lingered over the fields. The abandoned cottage lay ahead, nestled at the very edge of the village where the trees thickened and cast long shadows. As they neared the building, it became evident just how much time had worn it down. The once white walls were streaked with green, ivy creeping up the stone, as though nature itself sought to reclaim it. The roof sagged slightly, and the wooden shutters hung askew, their hinges rusted with age. Lucy hesitated just outside the gate. "I don't like it," she admitted in a whisper. Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile. "Fear often magnifies things in the dark, my dear, but in daylight all becomes clear." Pushing the creaky gate open, she stepped forward with quiet determination, her sharp eyes scanning the ground. The dirt path leading to the cottage door was marked with signs of disturbance. Footprints, fresh ones, though the damp earth had obscured any clear pattern. Lucy pointed toward one of the front windows. "That was the one I saw the light from." Miss Marple nodded. She walked up to the door and gently tested the handle. To her mild surprise, it turned. The door was unlocked. "Shall we?" she asked, glancing at Lucy. Lucy swallowed hard, but followed her inside. The interior was as forlorn as the outside, with dust motes swirling in the pale morning light that filtered through the grimy windows. The sitting room was sparsely furnished. The old wooden table, a fireplace long since cold, and a moth-eaten armchair by the corner. The air held the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Blood! Lucy had noticed it too. She clutched Miss Marple's arm. "There!" she whispered, pointing toward the floor near the fireplace. A dark stain marred the wooden boards. Not fresh, but not so old that time had erased it entirely. Miss Marple crouched slightly, studying the edges of the stain. Someone had attempted to scrub it away, but the effort had been half-hearted at best. Lucy shivered. Something happened here. Miss Marple straightened. "Yes, dear, I rather think you may be right." A sound from outside made Lucy gasp, footsteps crunching on the gravel path. Someone was approaching. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Lucy before turning toward the door, her expression calm but watchful. A moment later, the figure of a man appeared in the doorway. his brow furrowed with suspicion. "What the devil are you doing here?" Lucy flinched, but Miss Marple simply offered the man a polite smile. "Oh, dear me, I do hope we aren't trespassing. The door was unlocked, you see, and my young friend here was rather concerned after hearing strange noises last night." The man's frown deepened. He was tall, with dark hair that was beginning to silver at the temples. His coat was well made but worn, and his boots bore traces of mud. "This is private property," he said gruffly. "You've no business poking around." Miss Marple folded her hands together. "I do beg your pardon, Mr. The man hesitated before answering. "Hargreaves, Leonard Hargreaves. I own this property." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but inwardly she made note of his name. The abandoned cottage had been empty for years. How very curious that the owner should suddenly appear now. "We were under the impression that the cottage was abandoned," she said gently. Hargreaves exhaled sharply. "It was, but I have business here now." His gaze flickered toward the dark stain on the floor, and for the briefest moment something unreadable passed over his face. Miss Marple noticed. "Then I suppose you must know what happened here," she said mildly. His jaw tightened. "Nothing happened. This is my property, and I'd appreciate it if you left." Lucy opened her mouth as if to argue, but Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Of course, Mr. Hargreaves. We meant no harm." Hargreaves did not move as they passed by him, his eyes following them until they were clear of the doorway. As they stepped outside, Lucy turned to Miss Marple in a hushed whisper. "There's something he's not telling us," Miss Marple gave a small knowing nod. "Yes, my dear, there often is." They walked back toward the village in thoughtful silence, but Miss Marple's mind was already at work, sorting through the puzzle pieces. A light in the night, a scream, a bloodstain, and now a sudden owner claiming the property. Ish. This was a puzzle worth solving. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Village. The morning after the grim discovery at the abandoned cottage, St. Mary Mead was abuzz with speculation. The air, usually filled with the scent of fresh bread and morning dew, was now thick with whispers and conjecture. At the post office, Mrs. Harris, the postmistress, leaned forward conspiratorially as she handed Miss Weatherby her mail. "Have you heard, dear, about the poor man found dead at the old cottage?" she asked, eyes gleaming with the thrill of fresh gossip. Miss Weatherby, a woman of a nervous disposition, gasped. "Terrible business, and so close to the village. Who was he?" "That's just it," Mrs. Harris said, lowering her voice. "No one seems to know. Some say he was a tramp. Others think he might have been someone from the past, someone with a connection to that wretched place." Across the street at the greengrocer's, the conversation was much the same. Theories ranged from a robbery gone wrong to a secret rendezvous that ended in violence. The one constant was the name whispered among the villagers, Miss Marple. Everyone knew that the quiet elderly lady who lived at the end of the lane had a knack for solving mysteries. While the police might handle the official investigation, it was Miss Marple whom the villagers trusted to uncover the truth. At that moment, Miss Marple herself was seated in her cosy drawing-room, a delicate china teacup in hand, listening intently to her friend Colonel Arthur Melrose, The retired army officer, a long-time resident of St. Mary Mead, had been following the events with keen interest. "I tell you, Miss Marple, it's the most peculiar thing," he said, stirring his tea absent-mindedly. "The police say the man had no identification on him. No wallet, no papers, just a £1 note in his pocket and a broken wristwatch. Very deliberate, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "That is rather odd. And you say no one recognized him?" Melrose shook his head. "Not a soul, though of course we've yet to hear from Mrs. Bellamy." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. Mrs. Bellamy, the widow who lived on the outskirts of the village, had a remarkable memory for faces. If anyone could recognize the dead man, it was she. Before Miss Marple could respond, there was a knock at the door. Mary, her maid, entered with a note. "From Inspector Graves, ma'am. He's asking if you'd be so kind as to drop by the station later this afternoon." Miss Marple set down her teacup. It was unusual for the police to request her assistance so early in an investigation. Something about this case was different. By the time she arrived at the small police station, the usually composed Inspector Graves looked slightly harried. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I thought you might be able to shed some light on something." He opened a small evidence box and carefully placed a crumpled piece of paper before her. It was an old telegram, unsent. The message read, "Meet me at the cottage. Urgent, midnight. Do not tell anyone." Miss Marple's brows lifted ever so slightly. Most intriguing. Graves nodded. It was found in the victim's jacket pocket. But here's the strange thing, the telegram was never actually sent. So, did he write it for someone else? Or did someone else write it for him? Miss Marple tapped a finger against her chin. The implications were fascinating. If the telegram had never been sent, that meant whoever was supposed to receive it already knew to be there. That suggested prior arrangement, perhaps even collusion. "And there's something else," Graves continued. "Dr. Morrison, the coroner, estimates the time of death around midnight. Whoever this man was, he died at the very hour. He was meant to be meeting someone." Miss Marple sat back, the cogs in her mind turning. A man with no identity. A telegram that had never been sent. And a death that occurred precisely when he was expected at a secret meeting. "Oh dear," she murmured. "This does make things rather more complicated, doesn't it?" She smiled gently at the inspector, though behind her placid expression, her mind was already racing ahead, piecing together the fragments of a most intriguing puzzle. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. The soft chime of the clock on the mantelpiece echoed through Miss Marple's sitting room as she sat deep in thought. The details of the case, so few and yet so suggestive, circled in her mind like puzzle pieces, waiting to be fitted together. A man without identification, a meeting at midnight, a telegram that had never been sent. It was all so very deliberate. That afternoon, the village continued its fevered speculation. The abandoned cottage, long ignored and left to the slow decay of time, had suddenly become the focal point of everyone's attention. Conversations in the bakery, at the grocer's, and even at the vicarage revolved around the mysterious visitor who had met his end within its ruined walls. Meanwhile, Inspector Graves was conducting further inquiries, though with limited success. None of the villagers recognized the dead man, nor could they offer any reasonable explanation for his presence. The only person who might have some insight was Mrs. Bellamy, the widow with a sharp memory for faces. Miss Marple decided to pay her a visit. The Bellamy cottage stood at the edge of the village, overlooking a small orchard. Mrs. Bellamy, a woman of nearly 80, still carried herself with remarkable energy. She greeted Miss Marple warmly and invited her in for tea. "I'd assume you're here about the unfortunate business at the cottage," Mrs. Bellamy said as she poured tea into delicate china cups. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, my dear. I thought perhaps you might have seen the gentleman before. The police say he was a stranger, but that seems rather unlikely in a village where news travels faster than the wind." Mrs. Bellamy pursed her lips thoughtfully. "I did have a glance at the poor fellow when they brought the body to the station. At first I thought I had never seen him before, but then something about his face. It stirred a memory. A long time ago." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Do tell." "It must have been 30 years or more," Mrs. Bellamy continued, stirring her tea. "There was a young man who used to come here. He never stayed long, but he would visit the cottage. People whispered, of course, but no one knew exactly why. Then, one day, he simply stopped coming." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. And this man, could the deceased be him, grown older? Mrs. Bellamy nodded slowly. "It's possible. The features seem familiar, though time changes a person. But if it is the same man, then what was he doing back here after all these years?" Miss Marple pondered this. If the dead man had once been connected to the cottage, then his return had not been random. He had come back for a reason. But what could have drawn him after so many years? As she walked back through the village, she passed the old cottage, now cordoned off by the police. A chill breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. The cottage had been abandoned for so long, yet now it seemed to hum with a presence, as though it held secrets desperate to be uncovered. Inside the police station, Inspector Graves was examining the victim's few possessions once more. He looked up as Miss Marple entered. "Ah, Miss Marple! Anything of interest from Mrs. Bellamy?" "Perhaps," she said mildly. She believed she may have known the gentleman many years ago. He used to visit the cottage, though no one knew why. Graves frowned. "That's peculiar. We searched the place thoroughly. There was nothing inside except broken furniture and dust." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "Even dust can tell a story, Inspector." Graves sighed, rubbing his temple. "The real trouble is that we've no idea who this man was or why he came back. Without that, we're fumbling in the dark." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the evidence box on the desk. The telegram. It had never been sent, and yet the man had arrived. That meant the meeting had been prearranged. But with whom? She turned back to the inspector. "Have you considered checking the train records?" Graves blinked. "The train records?" "If the gentleman came to St. Mary Mead, it's quite likely he arrived by train. The station master may recall seeing him." Graves nodded slowly. "That's a good thought. I'll send someone over at once." As the inspector issued his orders, Miss Marple left the station. her mind ticking over with new possibilities. A man returning after decades, a midnight meeting, and an abandoned cottage with a history few remembered. There was something there, something just out of reach. And Miss Marple intended to find it. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. The soft chime of the clock on the mantelpiece echoed through Miss Marple's sitting room as she sat deep in thought. The details of the case, so few and yet so suggestive, circled in her mind like puzzle pieces, waiting to be fitted together. A man without identification, a meeting at midnight, a telegram that had never been sent. It was all so very deliberate. That afternoon, the village continued its fevered speculation. The abandoned cottage, long ignored and left to the slow decay of time, had suddenly become the focal point of everyone's attention. Conversations in the bakery, at the grocer's, and even at the vicarage revolved around the mysterious visitor who had met his end within its ruined walls. Meanwhile, Inspector Graves was conducting further inquiries, though with limited success. None of the villagers recognized the dead man, nor could they offer any reasonable explanation for his presence. The only person who might have some insight was Mrs. Bellamy, the widow with a sharp memory for faces. Miss Marple decided to pay her a visit. The Bellamy cottage stood at the edge of the village, overlooking a small orchard. Mrs. Bellamy, a woman of nearly 80, still carried herself with remarkable energy. She greeted Miss Marple warmly and invited her in for tea. "I assume you're here about the unfortunate business at the cottage," Mrs. Bellamy said as she poured tea into delicate china cups. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, my dear. I thought perhaps you might have seen the gentleman before. The police say he was a stranger, but that seems rather unlikely in a village where news travels faster than the wind." Mrs. Bellamy pursed her lips thoughtfully. "I did have a glance at the poor fellow when they brought the body to the station. At first I thought I had never seen him before, but then something about his face, it stirred a memory. A long time ago." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Do tell." "It must have been 30 years or more," Mrs. Bellamy continued, stirring her tea. "There was a young man who used to come here. He never stayed long, but he would visit the cottage. People whispered, of course, but no one knew exactly why. Then, one day, he simply stopped coming." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her cup. "And this man, could the deceased be him, grown older?" Mrs. Bellamy nodded slowly. "It's possible. The features seem familiar, though time changes a person. But if it is the same man, then what was he doing back here after all these years?" Miss Marple pondered this. If the dead man had once been connected to the cottage, then his return had not been random. He had come back for a reason. But what could have drawn him after so many years? As she walked back through the village, she passed the old cottage, now cordoned off by the police. A chill breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. The cottage had been abandoned for so long, yet now it seemed to hum with a presence, as though it held secrets desperate to be uncovered. Inside the police station, Inspector Graves was examining the victim's few possessions once more. He looked up as Miss Marple entered. "Ah, Miss Marple, anything of interest from Mrs. Bellamy?" "Perhaps," she said mildly. "She believes she may have known the gentleman many years ago. He used to visit the cottage, though no one knew why." Graves frowned. That's peculiar. We searched the place thoroughly. There was nothing inside except broken furniture and dust. Miss Marple's expression remained serene. Even dust can tell a story, Inspector. Graves sighed, rubbing his temple. The real trouble is that we've no idea who this man was or why he came back. Without that, we're fumbling in the dark. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the evidence box on the desk, the telegram. It had never been sent, and yet the man had arrived. That meant the meeting had been prearranged. But with whom? She turned back to the inspector. Have you considered checking the train records? Graves blinked. The train records? If the gentleman came to St. Mary Mead, it's quite likely he arrived by train. The station master may recall seeing him. Graves nodded slowly. That's a good thought. I'll send someone over at once. As the inspector issued his orders, Miss Marple left the station, her mind ticking over with new possibilities. A man returning after decades, a midnight meeting, and an abandoned cottage with a history few remembered. There was something there, something just out of reach. And Miss Marple intended to find it. Chapter 5. A Stranger's Journey. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple made her way to the railway station. She had always believed that small details, those so easily overlooked by others, often held the key to the truth, and in this case the question of how the murdered man had arrived in the village was one such detail. At the station, old Mr. Wickham, the station master, was sweeping the platform with slow, deliberate strokes. He had worked at the station for more years than anyone could remember, and had an excellent memory for faces. "Ah, Miss Marple," he greeted her, leaning on his broom. "Off to London today, or just visiting?" "Neither, my dear Mr. Wickham. I was hoping you might help me with a little inquiry." He raised an eyebrow. "About that unfortunate business at the cottage, I suppose." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Indeed. I wondered if you recalled a gentleman arriving on the evening train 2 nights ago. He was later found," she hesitated, "in rather tragic circumstances." Mr. Wickham's expression darkened. I remember him well. Odd sort of fellow. Came in on the 6:45 from Paddington, stepped off the train, looked about like he expected someone to meet him, but there wasn't a soul waiting." "Did he have any luggage?" "Just a small case. Not a proper travelling trunk. More like a briefcase, I'd say." Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the handle of her handbag. "And did he speak to anyone?" "Not a word. Least not that I saw. Walked out toward the village with a purposeful stride, like a man who knew exactly where he was going." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "And you've never seen him before?" Mr. Wickham shook his head. "No, ma'am, but I did notice something peculiar. When he stepped off the train, he took a good long look at the station clock, almost as if he was making sure of the time." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A man who knew where he was going, checking the time as though he had an appointment. And yet no one had met him, or if they had done so at the abandoned cottage under cover of darkness. Did anyone else alight from the train? She asked. Mr. Wickham frowned. "Now that you mention it, yes, a woman, well-dressed, maybe in her 50s. She was on the same train, but she kept her distance. Didn't seem to know the gentleman, at least not openly." Miss Marple's mind sharpened with interest. Did you happen to notice where she went? Went straight to the taxi rank. Didn't linger at all. Miss Marple thanked him and made her way back toward the village, her thoughts racing. A woman, travelling separately from the victim, but arriving on the same train, taking care not to appear connected to him. Could she have been involved? At the police station, Inspector Graves looked up as Miss Marple entered. "Ah, Miss Marple, I was just about to send word for you. We've identified the victim." She took a seat, folding her hands in her lap. "Oh." Graves pulled a telegram from his desk. His name was Charles Winthrop. He was an American businessman with some interests in London. According to his hotel, he received an urgent request to travel here. They found a note in his room mentioning an address, the old cottage. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with satisfaction. Then he was deliberately summoned, and yet no telegram was sent from the post office, which means the invitation was delivered another way. Graves sighed. That's what we need to figure out, and more importantly, why. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Inspector, have you considered the possibility that Mr. Winthrop was connected to St. Mary Mead in some way? People don't generally travel across the ocean for no reason. And Mrs. Bellamy suggested that she might have recognized him from many years ago." Graves tapped his fingers against the desk. "You think this is tied to the past? I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that very few crimes are entirely new. Most have roots that stretch back further than anyone cares to admit." There was a long silence before Graves nodded. "All right. I'll start looking into the village records, see if the name Winthrop turns up anywhere." Miss Marple stood. "And I shall follow a different line of inquiry. You see, Inspector, Mr. Wickham mentioned that another person arrived on the same train as Mr. Winthrop. A woman." Graves frowned. "A woman?" "Yes. Perhaps she is entirely unrelated. Or perhaps," Miss Marple added, "she holds the key to this entire affair." As she left the station, she allowed herself a small smile. The pieces were beginning to take shape, and she had the distinct feeling that the past was not quite as forgotten as some might have hoped. Chapter 6. The woman in grey Miss Marple sat comfortably in her little sitting room, a pot of tea on the tray before her, and a plate of untouched biscuits to the side. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, but her thoughts were far from the cosy surroundings. The woman who had arrived on the same train as Charles Winthrop occupied her mind. Who was she? And why had she taken such care to avoid being seen with him? She had already sent young Frida from the post office to make discreet inquiries about any strangers seen in the village over the past few days. The girl had a knack for noticing details, though of course she did not always recognize their significance. Miss Marple rather thought that was the advantage of being older. One had seen too many similar situations not to draw the right conclusions. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Graves. He looked slightly harassed, his brow furrowed in frustration. "I don't suppose you've had any sudden revelations, Miss Marple?" he asked, stepping inside as she gestured to a chair. Miss Marple smiled gently. "I have had a few thoughts, Inspector, though nothing that quite forms a complete picture yet. Well, perhaps between us we can manage it," he muttered, rubbing his temple. "I've been looking into Charles Winthrop's background. He was indeed an American, but here's the curious thing. His family was originally from England. More precisely, his mother was born in a village not far from here." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Ah," she said, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. "And do we know her name?" Graves nodded. "Margaret Winthrop, née Lichfield." Miss Marple's fingers stilled. "Lichfield? Oh, my dear Inspector, that does make things interesting. The Lichfield family once lived in a grand house not far from St. Mary Mead, but there was some dreadful scandal many years ago. A case of disputed inheritance, if I recall correctly." Graves looked intrigued. "Do you think it's connected?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. Crimes committed in the present are so often merely the echoes of those from the past. If Charles Winthrop came here for a reason, it may well have been tied to his mother's history. Graves let out a sigh. "And we still don't know who sent for him, or why he was killed." Miss Marple poured tea with a thoughtful expression. "I suspect our mysterious woman in grey may provide some answers." As if on cue, a sharp knock sounded at the door, and young Frida bustled in, slightly out of breath. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice urgent, "I found out about the lady from the train." Graves straightened in his chair. "Who is she?" Frida took a moment to catch her breath. Mrs. Letitia Gray. She checked into the Rose and Crown the night before the murder, and left early the following morning. The innkeeper said she seemed nervous, kept looking over her shoulder, and barely spoke to anyone. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes gleamed. "Mrs. Gray, you say? And she left before the body was found?" Frida nodded. "Yes, miss. She paid in cash and didn't leave an address." Graves frowned. "That's suspicious, to say the least." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "I rather think, Inspector, that Mrs. Gray is not our murderer. A guilty person would not draw attention by staying at an inn. No, I believe she was frightened. The question is, of whom?" Graves sighed. "Then we need to find her." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and I believe I know where to start." The following afternoon, Miss Marple took a taxi to the market town of Much Benning, where an old acquaintance, Mrs. Weatherby, resided. Mrs. Weatherby was a woman of insatiable curiosity, and had an uncanny ability to collect useful information. If anyone knew anything about the Lichfield family or Mrs. Gray, it would be her. Upon arrival at the Weatherby home, Miss Marple was greeted warmly and promptly served a generous slice of fruit-cake. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Weatherby exclaimed, settling into her armchair. "What a delightful surprise! But I suspect this is more than a social visit." Miss Marple smiled. "You know me too well, dear. I was hoping you might remember something about the Lichfield family." Mrs. Weatherby's eyes twinkled with interest. "Oh, indeed I do. A terrible business that was. Margaret Lichfield, she would be Charles Winthrop's mother, you say, was caught up in a scandal over her family's fortune. There was a dispute about the will after her father died. Some said he intended to leave everything to her, but at the last moment the documents were changed, and the estate passed to her cousin instead." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "How dreadful! Was there ever any suggestion of foul play?" Mrs. Weatherby pursed her lips. "Well, there were whispers, of course, but nothing was ever proven. Margaret left for America and never returned. The cousin, Edward Lichfield, lived in the house until his death some years ago." Chapter 7. The vanishing heiress Miss Marple arrived back in St. Mary Mead with her mind buzzing with possibilities. The tangled history of the Lichfield family was proving to be more than just an old village scandal. It was beginning to feel like the very key to Charles Winthrop's murder. If Margaret Lichfield had been unfairly cut out of her inheritance, then her son's sudden return to England might not have been mere coincidence. And then there was Letitia Gray. The woman who had fled the village mere hours before the murder was discovered. Inspector Graves had been sceptical when Miss Marple suggested that Letitia Gray was unlikely to be the murderer. People don't just run for no reason, he had said. But Miss Marple, with the wisdom of years, knew better. Fear was a powerful thing, and Letitia had been afraid. The real question was, who or what had driven her away? Determined to get to the bottom of it, Miss Marple paid a visit to the Rose and Crown, the inn where Mrs. Gray had stayed. The innkeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Atkinson, bustled forward the moment Miss Marple stepped inside. "Oh, Miss Marple, I expect you'll hear about that lady what stayed with us." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Indeed I am, my dear, Mrs. Letitia Gray. I understand she left rather abruptly." Mrs. Atkinson huffed. "That she did. Didn't even wait for breakfast. Just paid up and left at first light. Seemed nervous, she did. Kept glancing at the door. I remember thinking she looked like a woman expecting bad news." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "Did she mention where she was headed?" Mrs. Atkinson hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Well now, I'm not supposed to gossip, but she did ask the boy if there was a train to London that morning. That's all I know, mind you." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. London. It made sense. If Letitia had truly feared for her safety, the anonymity of the city would provide a welcome refuge. But hiding suggested guilt, or more likely that she knew something she wasn't supposed to. Leaving the inn, Miss Marple made her way to the post office. It was a quiet afternoon, and young Frida looked up from behind the counter with an eager expression. "I've done what you asked, Miss Marple," she said in a hushed voice. "I checked with the railway station. There was a woman matching Mrs. Gray's description on the morning train to London. And I made another interesting discovery." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Oh?" Frida leaned forward. "She wasn't alone." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which she had been absent-mindedly clicking together, suddenly stilled. "Do go on, dear." Frida nodded. "A man got on the train just after her. The ticket agent said he wasn't carrying any luggage, just a small case, and he kept looking around as if checking to see if he was being followed." Miss Marple's sharp mind immediately sprang into action. A mysterious woman fleeing the village, a man following her, and a dead American in an abandoned cottage. How did it all connect? That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fireplace, reviewing everything she knew. There were too many coincidences, and Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences. Charles Winthrop had arrived in St. Mary Mead, likely in search of something tied to his mother's past. He had met someone, possibly Letitia Gray, but their interaction had been secretive. Hours later, he was dead. Letitia had fled, pursued by a man who clearly had a vested interest in her whereabouts. Miss Marple considered the evidence before her. What had Charles been looking for? If he had come to England to reclaim something that had once belonged to his mother, it must have been tied to the Lichfield inheritance. And if Letitia had run, it meant she either knew the truth or feared she would be blamed. A sudden thought struck Miss Marple. What if the telegram Charles had sent the one that never reached its recipient, was the key to it all. What if it had contained the very information that had cost him his life? With a sense of urgency, she reached for her telephone and dialed. "Inspector Graves, Inspector," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I believe it is time we paid a visit to the telegraph office. I have a suspicion that an unsent telegram may hold the answers we seek." Chapter 8. The Unsent. Telegram Inspector Graves was not a man easily impressed, but he had come to regard Miss Marple with a grudging respect. Over the years, he had seen many an amateur detective interfere in his investigations, and most of them were more trouble than they were worth. But Miss Marple, well, she had a way of seeing things that others missed. And so, despite his initial skepticism, he found himself standing outside the small post office in St. Mary Mead, preparing to inquire about a telegram that might very well hold the key to Charles Winthrop's murder. The postmistress, a thin woman with a sharp nose and an expression of perpetual disapproval, greeted them with a wary look. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. Inspector." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Longworth. I do hope we're not troubling you, but there's a matter of some urgency we must discuss." Mrs. Longworth pursed her lips. "If it's about that terrible business at the old Lichfield cottage, I'm afraid I don't know anything." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Oh, I wouldn't expect you to, my dear. But you do keep very careful records, don't you?" The postmistress's eyes gleamed with professional pride. "That I do? And you would certainly recall if an American gentleman had sent a telegram shortly before his unfortunate demise?" Mrs. Longworth frowned, tapping her fingers on the counter. "An American, you say? Well, now that you mention it, yes, there was a gentleman who came in on the afternoon before they found the body. He had a peculiar way of speaking, kept calling me ma'am, and saying, 'Thank you kindly.' He wrote out a telegram, but—" She hesitated. "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple prompted gently. "Well, the oddest thing happened. Just as I was about to send it, he came rushing back in and snatched it right out of my hand. Said he'd changed his mind." Inspector Graves leaned forward. "Did you happen to read it?" Mrs. Longworth sniffed. "I'm not in the habit of reading people's private messages, Inspector." But then, with a small huff, she added, "Though I couldn't help but notice a name. It was addressed to someone in London, a Miss Letitia Gray." Miss Marple and Inspector Graves exchanged a look. Miss Marple's voice was mild, but her eyes were sharp. "Mrs. Longworth, I don't suppose you recall the exact wording of the telegram?" Mrs. Longworth considered for a moment. "I only saw the first few words before he snatched it back. Something like, 'I have found the truth at last.' And then the rest was folded over." A silence fell over the room. The significance of those words was not lost on either Miss Marple or the inspector. Graves straightened, and after that he was found dead. Mrs. Longworth nodded. "Yes, Inspector." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved rhythmically. "That suggests two things, does it not?" she said thoughtfully. "Firstly, that Charles Winthrop had indeed discovered something significant, perhaps about his mother's lost inheritance, and secondly, that he must have encountered someone after leaving this post office, someone who did not want that truth to be known." The inspector's brow furrowed. "And yet he never sent the telegram. Why?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet. because he intended to speak to Miss Grey in person, or because someone persuaded him not to. The implications were troubling. If Charles Winthrop had withdrawn his telegram under duress, it meant he had been threatened. And if that was the case, then his murderer had been lurking in St. Mary, Mead, before the crime was even committed. Inspector Graves exhaled sharply. That means we're looking for someone who was here, someone who knew Winthrop had found something and acted before he could share it. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, Inspector, and that narrows our list of suspects considerably, does it not? They left the post office deep in thought. The village square, usually bustling with cheerful activity, felt unusually tense. News of the murder had cast a shadow over St. Mary Mead, and everywhere they looked there were watchful eyes and whispered conversations. Miss Marple, moving at a leisurely pace, seemed entirely unbothered. She stopped near the grocer's, glancing at the neatly displayed fruit with a pleased expression. "People are such curious creatures," she murmured. Graves, who had known her long enough to recognize when she was thinking aloud, merely waited. She picked up a ripe pear, weighing it in her hands. "You see, Inspector, the truth is much like this fruit. It ripens slowly, but when it is ready to be plucked, one must act quickly, or it may be lost." The inspector sighed. "Are you suggesting we may lose our chance to catch the killer?" Marple smiled. "Not at all, dear Inspector. I merely suggest that the murderer knows time is running out. If Charles Winthrop knew the truth, someone else does as well. And when people are desperate, they make mistakes." Graves gave her a sharp look. "Are you expecting another move?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once more. "Oh, I should think so. The murderer has evaded us thus far, but the more we learn, the more pressure builds. We must be very careful, Inspector, for I do believe the next move will not be theirs, but ours." As they parted ways, Miss Marple took a slow stroll through the village, her sharp eyes observing every familiar face. She saw old Mr. Wilkins, who had been selling newspapers on the same corner for years, and young Tommy, Hayward, kicking a stone along the pavement. She noticed Mrs. Pettigrew whispering conspiratorially with the butcher's wife, and Reverend Lawson walking with his usual solemn stride. And then, quite suddenly, she saw something else, something that made her stop in her tracks. A figure, partially hidden behind the hedge near the vicarage, someone watching her. Miss Marple did not let on that she had noticed. She adjusted her scarf, gave a polite nod to a passing neighbour, and continued on her way, as if nothing was amiss. But inwardly her mind was racing, for she had recognized the figure instantly. It was the man who had followed Letitia Gray onto the train to London. Chapter 9. A dangerous pursuit. Miss Marple, ever the picture of unruffled calm, continued walking at her usual measured pace, though her thoughts were anything but leisurely. The sight of the shadowy figure lurking near the vicarage had sent a ripple of certainty through her. Whoever this man was, he was not merely a curious villager. He had followed Letitia Gray to London, and now he was here in St. Mary Mead, watching her. The significance of this was not lost on Miss Marple. It meant that the killer, or at the very least someone deeply involved in the crime, was growing anxious, and anxious people, she knew, tended to make mistakes. Rather than alerting the stranger to the fact that she had noticed him, she carried on as if nothing were amiss, making her way toward the churchyard. It was a well-worn path, flanked by weathered gravestones and trailing ivy, leading toward the vicarage garden. The perfect place for a private conversation, should one be necessary. The footsteps behind her were faint but unmistakable. Whoever was following her had no intention of being seen, but Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing people who wished to remain unnoticed. She quickened her pace ever so slightly, as if hurrying to seek refuge in the vicarage, and then, at the last moment, stepped behind a towering yew tree. The man hesitated, clearly thrown by her sudden disappearance, and that hesitation was all she needed. "Good afternoon," she said pleasantly, stepping out from her hiding place. The man jerked back in surprise, his hat slipping slightly on his head. He was tall, with a lean frame and an angular face. His suit, though well cut, looked slightly worn at the edges, and there was something about him that suggested unease. An energy coiled too tightly, as if he were a man always prepared to run. He recovered quickly, however, tipping his hat. "Begging your pardon, ma'am. Didn't mean to startle you." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh, not at all. Though I do wonder, have we met before?" The man hesitated. "I don't believe so." "Ah, perhaps I am mistaken," she said, peering at him with the innocent curiosity of an elderly woman who had nothing better to do than observe strangers. "Only, I do believe I saw you at the station, boarding the same train as Miss Letitia Gray." The man's expression flickered, just for a moment, but long enough. "I travel often," he said vaguely. "How very interesting," Miss Marple said. "And now you find yourself in St. Mary Mead, of all places." The man shifted. "Just passing through." "Of course," she said, her tone mild. "It's a charming village, though we've had some rather unfortunate events of late. A terrible business, really. The murder of Mr. Winthrop. And, of course, Miss Gray's unexpected departure. You wouldn't happen to know where she's gone, would you?" The man's lips pressed together, and for a moment Miss Marple wondered if she had pushed too far. But then he forced a smile. "Can't say I do, ma'am. Now, if you'll excuse me." He turned as if to leave, but at that very moment a new voice cut through the air. "That won't be necessary." Inspector Graves stepped into view, his sharp eyes locked onto the stranger. His presence was solid, commanding, an officer who had dealt with his fair share of criminals and had no patience for games. The man froze. Miss Marple clasped her hands together, utterly composed. "Ah, Inspector, how very fortunate. I do believe we were just about to have an interesting conversation." The inspector crossed his arms. "And who exactly are you?" The man hesitated again, then straightened. "Harold Finch." Graves raised an eyebrow. "Finch, is it? And what exactly is your business in St. Mary Mead?" Finch shrugged. "Like I told the lady, I'm just passing through." "Passing through?" Graves repeated. "Strange, considering you've been seen following Miss Gray. And now you're watching Miss Marple. If I didn't know better, I'd say you were trying very hard to keep an eye on certain people." Finch's expression darkened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Miss Marple's voice was as gentle as ever. "Oh, but I think you do, Mr. Finch. You see, Charles Winthrop was about to send a telegram before his death, one that would have revealed the truth. And you were there in London, watching Miss Gray when she received word of his murder." Finch's fingers twitched at his side. It was a small movement, but Miss Marple noted it carefully. A nervous gesture. A tell. Graves stepped closer. "You knew Winthrop, didn't you? Knew what he was looking for?" Finch swallowed. I never met him." "But you knew what he had found," Miss Marple said softly. "Something he wasn't meant to know. Something that got him killed." For a long moment Finch said nothing. The tension in the air was thick, every second stretching unbearably. Then, at last, he exhaled sharply. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I had to be sure." "Sure of what?" Graves demanded. Finch's jaw clenched. He looked at Miss Marple, then at the inspector, as if weighing his options. Then finally he muttered that she didn't have it. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Miss Grey?" Finch hesitated, then nodded. "Winthrop found something valuable, something that should have been lost a long time ago, but he wasn't the only one looking for it." Graves stepped forward. And what exactly was he looking for? Finch's eyes darted around, as if making sure they were alone. Then, lowering his voice, he said, "The letter." Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. "Ah," she said softly. Graves frowned. "What letter?" Finch glanced around once more, then muttered, "The letter that proves who really owned the Winthrop estate. The letter that changes everything." Silence fell. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly in front of her. "And I suppose," she said gently, "that someone was willing to kill to keep that letter hidden?" Finch hesitated, but his silence was all the answer they needed. Graves's expression hardened. "Mr. Finch, I think you'd better come with us." As the inspector took Finch by the arm, Miss Marple remained where she was, watching the scene unfold. A mystery unravelling, a truth nearly within reach. She had suspected from the start that this case was about more than murder. Now, at last, the final pieces were falling into place. And soon, very soon, she would see the whole picture. Chapter 10. Miss Marple's Revelation. The drawing-room of the vicarage was filled with an uneasy tension. Inspector Graves stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, his expression as unreadable as ever. Across from him sat Harold Finch, his fingers tapping restlessly on the armrest of his chair. Next to him, Letitia Gray perched on the edge of her seat, her face pale, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Reverend Harmon and Mrs. Winthrop had also been summoned, their presence a stark reminder of how deeply this crime had entangled the entire village, and in the midst of them all Miss Marple sat, her knitting resting lightly in her lap, her gaze as mild and unassuming as ever. It was time. She cleared her throat gently. "I dare say this has all been rather distressing," she began. "A murder is, of course, an awful thing, but what is worse, I think, is the way a crime of this nature can poison a village, sowing distrust, turning neighbours against each other, allowing suspicion to take root." She sighed, as if deeply saddened by the state of affairs. Then she lifted her head, her bright blue eyes sharp as steel. "That is why I believe it is time we put an end to all this unpleasantness." Graves nodded. "Quite right, Miss Marple. We have Harold Finch in custody, and it's clear he was looking for something Winthrop had. Now, if we could just determine—" "Oh, but, Inspector," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "Mr. Finch did not kill Charles Winthrop." A heavy silence fell over the room. Finch's head jerked up in surprise. Letitia Gray let out a sharp breath. Graves's eyes narrowed. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, Mr. Finch was most certainly involved, though I dare say in a rather less villainous capacity than one might assume. He was looking for something, yes, but not to keep it hidden. He was trying to recover what had been stolen." Els frowned. "Stolen?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. You see, Charles Winthrop was an honest man, a man with a strong sense of duty, who valued integrity above all else. So, when he came across something that should have been lost to time, he decided to set things right." She turned to Letitia Gray. "You, my dear, did not know what it was, but I suspect you sensed it. That is why you were afraid. That is why you ran." Letitia's lips parted, but no words came. Miss Marple continued. Charles Winthrop had found a letter that changed everything, a letter that proved beyond any doubt that the Winthrop estate did not rightfully belong to him. Mrs. Winthrop made a small gasping sound. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "It was never truly his. There was an heir who had been cast aside, whose claim had been buried. And Charles Winthrop, being the man that he was going to set it right. He was going to send a telegram, an urgent one, to a solicitor in London, ensuring that the truth could no longer be hidden." She paused. "And that," she said softly, "is why he was killed." All eyes turned toward Finch, but Miss Marple shook her head. "Not by Mr. Finch." She looked at him with something almost like sympathy. "No, Mr. Finch was searching for that letter, because he knew, just as Winthrop had, that the truth had to come to light." She turned her gaze to the fireplace where the embers still smouldered faintly. "But it is too late for that now, isn't it?" Letitia let out a strangled gasp. Miss Marple sighed. "Oh, yes, Miss Gray. I imagine you saw it too. Someone burned the letter." There was a long pause. Then a soft voice said, "I had to." No, head swiveled toward Mrs. Winthrop. She sat very still, her hands trembling in her lap, her eyes wide and full of something between grief and madness. Miss Marple regarded her with deep sadness. "You loved him very much, didn't you?" Tears welled in Mrs. Winthrop's eyes. "He was my whole life," she whispered. "Everything we built, everything we had, it was all because of him. And then that letter, it was going to take it all away." Miss Marple nodded. "You knew, of course, that Charles would not turn away from what he believed to be right." Mrs. Winthrop's expression twisted. "He couldn't," she said bitterly. "I begged him. I pleaded. But he wouldn't listen. He said the truth mattered more than anything." "And so," Miss Marple said softly, "you silenced him." A sob broke from Mrs. Winthrop's lips. Graves stepped forward, his expression hard. "Mrs. Winthrop, are you confessing to the murder of your husband?" She did not respond. Miss Marple sighed. "You took the poker, didn't you? The one by the fireplace. You struck him once, and it was enough. Then you saw the letter that had caused all of this, and you burned it before anyone could see." Mrs. Winthrop let out a hollow laugh. "It doesn't matter now, does it?" she whispered. "It's gone. The truth is gone." Miss Marple shook her head. "Oh no, my dear. The truth is never gone. Because truth is not just words on a page. It is the things people remember, the things people know." Graves nodded grimly. "Mrs. Winthrop, I'm afraid you'll have to come with me." The widow did not resist as the inspector placed a firm hand on her arm. She merely sat there, staring into the dying fire, as if trying to find the past in the embers. As she was led away, silence filled the room. Miss Marple, ever composed, resumed her knitting. At last, Letitia Gray spoke. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not all along, my dear, but I suspected." She glanced at Finch. "And I imagine you suspected as well." Finch nodded slowly. "I thought something was wrong, but I never imagined." He trailed off, shaking his head. Miss Marple gave him a kindly look. "The world is full of tragedy, Mr. Finch, but in the end, justice has a way of finding its course." Letitia exhaled shakily. "And the estate?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Ah, well, the law is a curious thing, my dear. Even without the letter, I rather suspect that the truth will find its way to the right people." With that, she rose, smoothing her skirt. "Now, I do believe it is time for tea. The vicar has a rather excellent blend, and I should very much like a cup." And with that, as if the terrible events of the past days were no more than a troubling puzzle that had now been neatly solved, Miss Marple strolled toward the kitchen, leaving the rest to reflect on what had passed. For in the end, murder, lies, and greed could not stand against the quiet, persistent force of truth. And that, Miss Marple knew, was the most powerful thing of all.